And we are live. Welcome, everyone. We have a special guest today. But before that, this channel is proudly sponsored by Magi-Knights Awakening. This is a magical girl, Super Sentai inspired tabletop RPG where you get to confront mythos-like horrors. You will find it in the description and in the pinned comment. This channel is also proudly sponsored by D&D Studios, the publishers and developers of Dames of Asstoria, a tabletop role-playing game where you play as monster girls, experiencing high adventure in a world that doesn't fully accept them. They have recently released Daughters of Lamb. This is a pay-what-you-want tabletop RPG, where you play as cybernetic nuns with guns, looking for the missing pieces of their AI god. You will find it in their website. The links will be in the description and in the pinned comment. This channel is also proudly sponsored by the Red Room Publishing. Please check out their store for exclusive tabletop RPG products. They have recently released Savage Swords. This is a Conan-inspired tabletop role-playing game where you get to explore ancient civilizations and confront forgotten nightmares. You will find it in the description and in the pinned comment as well. So today we have Derek Garcia. He is the author of Forgotten Fate. If you like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and JRPGs, especially on the theme, on the atmosphere of Shin Megami Tensei, you are going to love it. Derek, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Abraham. Appreciate it.
Now, before we go deeper into Forgotten Fate, well, let's talk about your origins. When was the first time you played tabletop RPGs?
Oh, geez, I've probably been playing since like middle school. Roughly that like seventh, eighth grade level. Second edition, advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Kind of dated myself there, but so yeah, it's been a while. I've been with the hobby over 2 decades now. But probably at least maybe 1 decade worth of sort of feeling like I know what I'm doing. But yeah, no, kind of a while now. So yeah. Mhm.
And that applies to everything, right? We oftentimes think that we know everything about a particular thing, and a door opens, and you notice, wow, there is this other cool thing that you can do when you play this or that, and you become amazed, right?
Yeah, I think you have to get some of the like really terrible campaigns and characters out of your way. I think it's just a rite of passage with tabletop RPGs. You got to kind of make the mistakes to learn from them firsthand. No matter how many good books and YouTube tutorials and whatever there are, you just kind of have to go and learn through experience and kind of have some funny anecdotes to look back on. But it's good. It's all part of the game.
My origins are also pretty hilarious, but yeah, I had like one of the worst starts that I had when it comes to tabletop RPGs.
We have
Picture
some
this,
horror
just
stories.
learning tabletop RPGs in a bit like a bar slash hobby store, like a low end bar that also works as a hobby store. You can pretty much imagine.
Yeah. No, I could see a lot of complications coming out of that. So.
And throughout the years, did you usually play only Dungeons and Dragons or did you play other systems?
No, a bunch of stuff. I still try to change it up pretty frequently, and I'd say that's a good thing. The D&D itself has changed a lot over the years, but there's dozens, hundreds of really interesting tabletop RPGs out there, and I think everybody, I probably most people start with D&D. It's probably the most common entry point into the tabletop RPG hobby, but everybody who's if you've played for a decent amount of time, definitely try some other stuff. If nothing else, even if you like D&D the most, you might pick up some things that could make your D&D games, your D&D characters better. Because a lot of the other games just will have a completely different paradigm, a different take on what a tabletop RPG is and things, and that can be really nice to kind of get out of that very narrow kind of window of how D&D is built. So no, I've played a ton of things. Did a lot of the like White Wolf World of Darkness games back in the day, a few of the more like experimental ones recently, like Apocalypse World and different systems, Fantasy Flights, Cortex, just like Savage Worlds, some of the point-based stuff, Big Eye Smallmouth, Anima Beyond. I've tried a lot of games, so and I think that's good. Every single tabletop RPG out there that has something different to offer, and something new.
Yes, that's true. I can actually, I'm having a difficult time trying to think of a single player that didn't start with Dungeons and Dragons. But definitely, the more RPGs you play, you sometimes get that sort of that mix of ideas that, oh, this system is also really cool. Maybe I can take some of that and put it into Dungeons and Dragons, or maybe you can take this other system and use it over there. And I wonder, when you created Forgotten Fate, do you think that perhaps that influenced the design process from the very start?
Oh, 100%. I mean, nothing, if we're all being honest, like no idea is entirely just like original came to us out of the vacuum. We're all building on existing literature, other experiences. So I would say in a big way, a lot of elements of Forgotten Fate were, in part, I don't want to say like a best of, but taking, things I've loved from different RPGs that I've played in or ran over the years that I think would mix okay with kind of the fifth edition D&D framework. I mean, some ideas are just kind of too alien to D&D to really fit in there, but a few of them surprisingly can, so things like the variant inspiration system it pulls from, I mean, technically from like Carl Jung and psychology, but very old White Wolf games in the World of Darkness had a similar concept of like instead of an alignment, characters having a persona and shadow, for example. And there's no reason that can't work perfectly well with alongside D&D and its alignments. Just a lot of different inspirations in the fiction itself of Forgotten Fate and the setting aren't just drawing from books and movies and literature, but to a degree kind of concepts that I've encountered and liked, and just a bunch of different tabletop RPGs. So yeah, it definitely draws from a lot of the different games I played of, not just solely D&D. Yep.
It's like I always say that roleplay solves everything. So I can easily imagine that you took those concepts and you just, well, the Dungeons and Dragons can perfectly accommodate those themes, that atmosphere, those mechanics. There is no problem at all. And that also makes me curious, where was the spark? When was the moment when you thought, maybe I should take Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and add it a bit of like a JRPG touch to it?
Yeah, I mean, it did start with the setting first, and then the idea to sort of do a full rules revision along with it sort of came after. But with the setting, it was getting closer and closer to, I think, like the 25th anniversary of Eberron, which I don't know if you remember, but Eberron was Keith Baker's setting that came out during 3.5 D&D, I believe, and they had Wizards of the Coast had done a big like contest. I didn't enter, but a contest where different people entered, and Eberron was the winner, and it became this new published setting. And what I'd always been impressed about Eberron, still one of my favorite settings, but was that it took what then were the current rules of D&D 3.5 and sort of took all these and said, well, what kind of a world might come out of these assumptions? Like 3.5 had a system, I think in the core rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide about like magic item creation and how it cost experience points and things like that. And that was worked really firmly into the kind of the fiction of Eberron, where you had artificers and this like magic item economy. And I always thought that was very cool that they had this distinct setting to kind of showcase the best of what these rules are. So that was kind of where it started with for Forgotten Fate as a setting, because there are a lot of official 5th edition settings from Wizards, but none of them are new. They're either ports of old, Forgotten Realms, kind of legacy settings like Ravenloft, or they're brought over from Wizards other IPs like Magic the Gathering, or like a partnership with Critical Role for, the Exandria. But nothing like designed from the ground up to say like, here's something that really kind of showcases what makes 5th edition different and feel different from other games and other versions of D&D. So that was what kind of sparked the idea of the Forgotten Fate setting. And then from there, it was just, well, what do I like? What do I think is cool? And that's where it got into I like some of the weirder, surreal JRPGs like Shin Megami Tensei and Persona and stuff. I like, weird fiction, China Mayville and Michael Moorcock and Philip K. Dick. And, but yeah, just the desire to have like an original setting that, to me anyway, like leaned into feeling like it showcases kind of the best of 5th edition was where it started. And then the idea to bolt on a pretty elaborate rules revision came after the fact from seeing other products doing that. There's right now there's Tales of the Valiant from Cobalt Press. There's Level Up from Ian Publishing. Cubicle 7 is working on their own C7D20, where there's these third-party games that are kind of their own unofficial 3.25 or whatever you want to call it, like their own revisions to D&D's rules. And I seen a couple of those, and they weren't exactly the way I would do it. So since I was already writing my own setting, I said, well, yeah, I'll also do this full rules revision. So it ended up being a pretty lengthy book. It clocks in pretty close to 300 pages between redoing, between revising a lot of the fifth edition rules, and then having, in addition to that, almost a couple hundred pages worth of setting. But it started with the setting. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the setting, to the world of Forgotten Fate, is it actually a true mix of all of the influences that you have mentioned, Shin Megami Tensei and all of that? Or was there like a greater influence upon the world? Like, oh, it was mostly Shin Megami Tensei, or it was mostly this other game?
Well, before picking any of the influences, I just really wanted something that would have some real, like to me anyway, originality and novelty. Because there are, including the third-party settings, there's dozens of fifth edition D&D compatible campaign worlds already. I mean, from a lot of authors, a lot of publishing houses. And a few of them do have some, very distinctive kind of original traits to them. But I guess I kind of miss seeing settings that really felt like they had stories that you could only tell it in that specific world. Like Ghost Walk was a very different setting. It was like a 3-5 setting where ghosts and humans interacted. So I was seeing a lot of settings, but a lot of the more original ones were original when they first came out because they were ports again from other games and other editions. So it kind of started with, what can I do that's original, that if people read about the setting, they'll say, oh, this is specifically unlike every other setting on the market. So that's where I had this idea of, well, what if we had a world with very limited history, with like 50 years worth of history? Because most fantasy settings are defined by 1,000 years ago, this city was founded, and you're in the ruins of something ancient, and just kind of this dependency on things that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And specific characters with amnesia is kind of a trope, but I'm like, well, what if we had a setting with a very brief known history? And then it came down to like, well, do I want this to be a recently created setting? Do I want to make something about, the dawn of creation? And I thought, no, let's go weirder than that. So that's kind of from there where it spiraled into, well, how do I rationalize a world that has this limited history, and this kind of Lovecraftian old one is responsible? And that just kind of got the plate spinning on all the different ideas that became Forgotten Fate. But it started with just wanting to do something really different that would feel different from, distinctly different from doing a Forgotten Realms game or an Iron Kingdoms game or in any of the other settings. Yep.
Well, that is extremely interesting. Did you mention a game or a setting called Ghost Walk?
Yeah, Ghost Walk was it was sort of a smaller book, I remember, but it was, again, I think it was 3.5 era D&D, and it centered on, I think it was called the City of Manifest, and it had all these cool rules about if you died, your character, you'd now play as a ghost version of that character. And, again, it was a kind of a narrower setting focus because it was pretty much a city that you could kind of plug into anything else, but it was different. It was kind of hyper focused, but if your DM says we're doing a Ghost Walk game, that has very different expectations than if they just said we're doing Greyhawk or we're doing Forgotten Realms. Like, okay, this is going to feel very different from just kind of a vanilla fantasy world. So that was just an example, but yeah, I did add a little bit of Ghost Walk influence even in Forgotten Fate with there's I went with like the Otherworld planar model and like certain areas where the living and the dead can interact. So a little bit of that inspiration got in there too.
I'm going to look into that one because this is the first time I've heard of Ghost Walk.
It
So
was
definitely
cool. I
look
might have
into
been
that.
amongst the like 5 people who actually ran a Ghost Walk campaign, but I liked it. So yeah, if you can track it down, I'm sure the PDF's out there somewhere. It was a cool book. Yeah.
Now, what I was going to mention about the Forgotten Fate world is that even though you went like full science fantasy with it, I think it still has some things that resonate for a lot of us that like to delve into history, because as you mentioned, well, for those that are not aware, in Forgotten Fate, there is this certain like an amnesia. People have
Yeah.
forgotten the constructions, the civilizations, the technology of the past. So I think that's one of the greatest strengths of Forgotten Fate, from what I understand of the game world itself. Because, for example, let me show you this image over here. In fact, you could say that this image could serve as inspiration to more or less uh, color your Forgotten Fate campaigns. Take a look at this beautiful building.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it before?
Um, I
I
may
bet
have
you
Virginia, Massachusetts,
maybe
Maryland, but yeah,
Massachusetts, exactly. Could you actually believe that they say that this building was destroyed in a fire?
yeah. I mean, that it seems like a lot of stone. That seems hard to believe, but still,
Exactly, not flammable. This is not flammable at all. So when we explore Forgotten Fate, it makes you think of some the science fiction YouTube, some real world situations.
yeah. I mean, and that was kind of a a draw. If you have all these unknowns in the world, then anything can sort of become mysterious. So if you have something that is just a what you might describe in the players like, oh, they're describing a record shop, with all these strange discs with mysterious writing and pictures on them, and big discs of vinyl. But yeah, I went with this kind of complicated plot device of, again, the Whisperer, this space alien Lovecraftian old one entity that attacked the world and had this big war and everything. But it was a lot of hoops to jump through to get to this point of kind of all of old history and its languages just being kind of tainted with this like collective, supernatural PTSD sort of. But I kind of like that vibe where you could have a dungeon that's kind of a classic D&D dungeon of an old crypt with a necromancer or a lich at the bottom, but it could just be the mall, like some place where now all of those, the words, the writing, the images are kind of familiar but alien, and trying to read the writing is, recalling things that you weren't meant to remember and bringing on that kind of Lovecraftian insanity. And yeah, so that definitely was kind of a vibe intended of just having, you know, unusual dungeons too. And I think that, kind of led to kind of the JRPG inspiration because I don't know, anime and JRPGs, to me, one of the things that they're always synonymous with was just having a lot more anachronistic blends of things. Like JRPGs would frequently have, very medieval looking things, but then one guy in blue jeans, that kind of thing. Like they've always, a lot of them, except for the very purest ones, like maybe a Dragon Quest, but most of the Final Fantasy games for many years and stuff, and just a lot of them have really played with like mixing things that don't belong together, but it creates kind of a very cool, unique vibe, and that's something I wanted to get out of Forgotten Fate. And having the amnesia kind of plot device means, well, you don't really know why these things coexist, and there's some stuff there for the DM that maybe these were two separate worlds that were merged as part of the kind of consequences of this attack. Maybe there's a perfectly good reason why you kind of have modern technology developing along high fantasy magic, but I left some things in there where the DM can kind of have some liberty to take the story in the direction they want to. But it's a vibe I've always been fond of, that cool juxtaposition of things that don't necessarily belong together. So, yeah.
And was it challenging to set like a level for that technology? Because I can imagine that you played around with the idea. So maybe it's technology up to the Renaissance, or maybe it's technology all the way like you would see in your typical sci-fi show.
Yeah, I did sort of consider like, oh, do I want to go full sci-fi on this and things like that? But there's enough, kind of modern technology that arguably we kind of live in a cyberpunk setting. If you look back at the way people envision the future in the 70s and 80s, we may not have quite as much neon and that sort of thing, but there's plenty going on with modern technology where it can feel very science fiction, especially from the perspective of people without a lot of context for it. So I did decide to mostly keep it at modern technology, but that still includes a lot. There's cell phones, computers, vehicles. We have our particle accelerators. I mean, these are all things that actually exist in the real world. So yeah, I ended up going like, modern technology is fine. There's plenty of room for exploration of kind of science fiction themes with the things that we have now. and I did sort of compartmentalize that. Well, the main continent where most of the action will take place for most games, the one that's fleshed out the most. Polemos has, kind of, I think I mentioned sort of like late 90s, early 2000s technology. And then one of the other continents, Chobal, I gave more like, okay, they're up to like modern technology with drones and, kind of more advanced stuff, but still nothing that really is out things that exist. So it's definitely, it has a science fiction vibe, but I think you get that anytime you have guns and computers in the same setting as, people casting fireball or cure light wounds. So,
And I think it's a very, how you say, thought-provoking setting as well. Because as I was reading the Forgotten Fate world, I had this image of the adventurers going through ruins and suddenly discovering these ancient pieces of technology. Because, for example, let me share another image over here. Mm-mm-mm. They could be entering this weird temple and suddenly they find a car.
right.
They find someone driving a car, and what is that?
Right.
Whoa!
Right. What is the
Or maybe
context
they find
of this?
an airplane. What? So I think that's perfect for Forgotten Fate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's absolutely a vibe that, you could get out of it. And yeah, again, like I mentioned, Shin Megami Tensei just because that's kind of the JRPG series that to me was most synonymous for leaning into kind of that. Like if you've played many of those games, they lean into this blend of all kinds of real world religions and faiths, along with elements of fiction and literature. Still have Lovecraftian entities, but they'll also have things pulled from, again, real world mythology and different things, kind of all in this melting pot of modern aesthetics, but a whole lot of weird, dark, supernatural, end of the world stuff going alongside that. So that ended up kind of being the touchstone. And I mean, there is an official Shin Megami Tensei tabletop RPG now. There wasn't at the time I was starting the writing, but I felt like that was there are other tabletop RPGs going for a more general JRPG style, like Fabula Ultima, some licensed ones like the East game, but and now there actually is the official Shin Megami, but it still felt like a less like there aren't enough that like have this specific niche vibe of you've got Gnosticism and apocalyptic prophecies and just kind of all this along with kind of some of the trappings of a Dungeons and Dragons game. So yeah, I thought that'd be a cool thing to put in there, and hopefully, everyone's different in what they look for when they're DMing. Some people really like I want a pre-written adventure path that sends my characters from level 1 to 20. Those never really got me going as much, but I liked settings that just had a lot of intriguing things of like when I'm reading it as a DM, I can think, oh, this makes me think of so many cool stories I can tell in this world, or twists I can introduce. And so arguably when we write something, we're kind of writing it for ourselves, but I'm like, well, if any DMs are thinking like me where they're reading to look for cool plot hooks and things to jump into their mind, like that was a big focus. So yeah.
And when it comes to the mechanics, I think that it was great that you chose Shin Megami Tensei as a source of inspiration, as a major source, because yes, the current Shin Megami Tensei tabletop RPG, as I understand it, based on reviews and whatnot, it is a good tabletop RPG, but the other Shin Megami Tensei games have been completely smashed by various critics. So now, if someone likes Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, but for whatever reason doesn't want to get the Shin Megami Tensei, he can choose Forgotten Fate,
Sure.
which brings
Or
me to the next point. When it comes to designing the rules for Forgotten Fate, what made you decide not to dramatically or rather drastically alter the core Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition system?
yeah, I would say because that was one of the big, like I had a whole bullet pointed list of like mission statements for the rules, and keeping it very compatible was a big one because so far a lot of the other third party kind of revisions to the 5th edition rules, will sort of note X degree of compatibility, but on reading them, like, well, this isn't actually as compatible as it presents itself. And even the official, the official revision came out in the past few months of the, 2024 to 2025 fifth edition revision, and it's not as compatible with the original 2014 rules as it sort of presented itself to be either. So I wanted it to be compatible in part so that people can use the stuff they know they like, the classes and subclasses from all the books they've bought and all the third party books they've bought. They don't have to really relearn the wheel, or remake the wheel, so to speak, to play. And so part of it was that let people keep it as compatible as possible and make it so that any of the rules changes are really modular and they're not linked in this kind of way where, oh, if you don't use this rule, it'll break this rule and this rule. So, I'm fully aware a lot of people, if they get a revision like this or Tales of the Valiant or any of them, some people may sort of cherry pick this rule and that rule and not necessarily go, we're doing 100% this, and that's fine. So I wanted to kind of lean into that and go, yeah, like that's totally fine. If you want to use this revised initiative system but want to keep the old system for player character saving throws, you can do that. They don't, they're purposely kind of siloed so that people can pick and choose which rules they want to use. And again, that was all very deliberate. Like, I wanted people to be able to look at it and go, does this rule make my D&D game better or worse? And I mean, I'd like to think all the rules would make them better, because otherwise I would have written them. But everybody's different, every table's different. So I did want to write it so that you can just run Forgotten Faith, the setting, with the original 2014 5e rules. You could run it with all of the new rules, or you could look through them and say, which of these new rules do we want to use, and which do we want to stick with what we kind of know and we've been playing for the last 10 years. So that was definitely a very deliberate choice to try to keep it not completely connected, which did involve, as you mentioned, doing less kind of drastic and sweeping changes to the rules. But I didn't want to, I building a system from the ground up is a huge project too. Not to say I wouldn't tackle that someday. That's just not what I was going for in this case. So.
And it's interesting because about a month ago or so, I mentioned Forgotten Fate, and I showed the system to a couple of friends, and they actually said, well, this feels actually like an improvement of the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition setting. And I immediately thought of Pathfinder Unchained, that book that pretty much clarified everything that was ambiguous of the core rules. So Forgotten Fate, in a sense, it also feels like a clarification, not only a modification, but a clarification of the core Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition system.
I'm glad they felt that way, because yeah, that was a big design goal, and I was actually a really big fan of the Pathfinder and Chain line. I mean, they came out kind of late in Pathfinder, so not everybody adopted them, but I loved those books. So, but yeah, it's that was also a big design goal, just kind of clarifying a lot of 5th edition rules, because there's, and again, every table's different, but there are a lot of rules that just aren't there in the official 5th edition, and that say, when you're druid wild shapes, what equipment can you wear? I don't know. Ask your dungeon master. Which is interesting to me, because it feels like it's a little bit of an unfinished rule set. Because to me, like a dungeon master, an individual game master at a table will always house rule whatever they want to. They'll always override any rule they disagree with. But having a kind of an incomplete rule set by design feels strange to me. It feels like a strange thing for a very kind of high-end mainstream product. And there just are all these edge cases, or at least I felt, in the 5th edition rules that are, maybe not intentionally ambiguous, but they are ambiguous. So that was a very big goal, not as much to like completely reinvent the game, but to clarify the game, to give people, a set of rules they can understand, that ask questions that'll come up at almost every table, so the DM isn't forced to make a judgment call. I mean, as a DM, if you want to change something, that's fun because you want to change it. That's very different from being forced to make a judgment call about something you really didn't want to, that, waste time at the table, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was a big goal, is making sure that this is a clearer system than 5th edition, or 2014 5th edition. Yeah.
And it's also a bit fascinating because on the rules side, on the game side, you could say you have a contrast between Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in Forgotten Fate. Gary Gygax was all about, we should have a rule for that. Let's write a rule for that. And Dave Arneson was like, come up with something on the spot, your judgment call. But on the theme side, both Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax were a bit in harmony when it comes to like that ancient past with technology. A lot of people ignore this, but both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, they had it so that their medieval fantasy settings were actually the future
Yeah.
of ages ago. A lot of you know, of course, you know it as well. But for those of you watching Greyhawk, there's actually a technological background to Greyhawk to the point that you can actually look at dungeons as if they were like ancient bunkers. And
Yeah.
many of the monsters are mutations from the ancient science fiction experiments that were carried out during the Gamma World or Metamorphosis Alpha type of age. And you can also see that in the great Blackmoor setting. There's also this technological past. So I
Oh,
think
yeah. There's
Forgotten Fate
that Barrier
did
Peaks
a
module, I think, with the spaceship and all that. Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead.
uh, no, I was just saying that it did a great job, and which brings me to my next point. How did you come up with the idea of designing this new class, the Weapon Master?
So that was really about kind of bringing back something that I and a lot of other players kind of missed out on, or missed from, that have been present in fourth edition and third edition, which was this kind of like tactically interesting character that's still a martial character. There's still somebody swinging a sword or an axe, but playing them is more than kind of repeating the same attack routine where you're making, real kind of meaningful decisions round in the same way that a mid or high level spellcaster in D&D will have a whole list of spells to choose from. So whenever their turn comes around, they kind of have a decision to make. They have, all these tools in their chest, and as opposed to a, mid or high level fighter who they have the attack action, which is an amazing tool. It'll do a lot of damage. They might make 4 attacks per round, or action surge and make 8. It's a great tool, but it's just the one tool. So when I was designing the Weapon Master, I wanted to be very careful with balance. I probably erred more on, if I was concerned that it would overstep the real, the 2014 fighter, I toned things down to make sure that the two could coexist at the same table. But that was the main goal of, 3.5 had the Book of Nine Swords, the Tome of Battle, where you had like the Crusader and the Warblade, and these classes that had these, cool sounding maneuvers that would let you move and attack and respond in all these unusual ways. All of the fourth edition martial characters were built, with that same kind of assumption of having a whole plethora of moves to draw from. You're not just walking up and hitting something; you have choices to make. So it was about bringing that back, where you have a martial character, but it has at least some of the kind of interesting decisions to make, some of the tactical complexity of a spellcaster.
And I think a lot of players are going to be are going to feel encouraged to play a martial class because I have encountered some players that say, well, the fighter doesn't have as many options as the wizard or as the cleric, but with the weapon master, you have those options at the ready. You have all of those disciplines, move, techniques, tactics. In the case of the fighter, unless you are someone that is really into, let's say, like real world fighting techniques, then yeah, you're going to go nuts, half swording your weapon and attacking under the armpit of the opponent and using the flat of your blade and whatnot. But the weapon master really makes it very simple for you to have that fun of a plethora of choices, employing the particular martial arts technique that, depending on the situation, correct?
Yeah, that was a big goal with it there. That it's not just the people playing wizards and clerics that have options, and some players, as you mentioned, do just enjoy having a lot of variety, a lot of different things to pull from, different options, and so that is something that might make a weapon master a lot more attractive than just playing like a fighter or a barbarian or a similar class in 5e. But again, there was a lot that went into making sure the balance is such that it's not going to out damage a fighter. Fighter, and this is more from a mechanics analysis standpoint than like a the thematic things you were mentioning. But there was a lot of number crunching that went into making sure the thing the fighter does very, very well in fifth edition, which is a ton of single target damage. When you're adding in sharpshooter, a great weapon master, and action surging, they're gonna making sure the weapon master doesn't step on that role, but they can do different things that kind of make them stand out without obsoleting the fighter. To the point where, well, why would we ever have a fighter at our table? We've got the weapon master now. Now they're both very valid choices, both numbers and kind of theme wise, where if you want to play that, grizzled soldier who's, not fancy, they've just learned to, kill something dead and keep going. The fighter might still be the best option for that kind of character, but something that's at, a character that's maybe had more of a, maybe more formal training, or who's, picked up more tricks, along the years, someone who, fights with more of a distinct style as opposed to just kind of pragmatic, get the job done. Well, maybe that'd be a weapon master. So there's both story reasons you pick one, but also they do different things mechanically at the table. So, yeah.
I can definitely see that consistency because the fighter is always this like more steadfast, always there, mid shield to take care of the brunt of things. And the weapon master, to me, he feels more like a situational character that can turn the tide of the battle, but very situational. You're not going to be tanking the entire path to glory. You're going to be waiting for your chance to employ your particular techniques in order to kill the caster or get the upper hand on that enemy that the fighter is having problems with. So it's quite feasible to have both a weapon master and a fighter in the same party, and they're
Yeah.
not going to overstep their own particular areas of expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did try to write it in such a way that it's very much a team player kind of class, because most of, I mean, if anybody's kind of a numbers dork about D&D like I am, most of the most powerful things a weapon master can do are those maneuvers where they kind of create an opening for all their buddies to stab the bad guy, where you all surround them and they create this opening where other people can use their reactions. Now we're all attacking the same target and things like that. And that's a point where you absolutely can have the barbarian with the great axe and great weapon master and reckless attack, things like that benefit from the weapon master along with the rogue getting the sneak attack. And, so just a lot of ways, I tried to write it where the weapon master can work with other classes instead of making it so it's overshadowing them, or, oh, great, now none of us are going to play rogues anymore. No, there's great reasons to have both a rogue and a fighter and a weapon master at the same table. And they'll end up complementing each other a lot better versus other classes where they kind of do their own thing. And, teamwork is more about giving each other a high five afterwards. So,
This makes me think of the commercial aspect of Forgotten Fate because, yes, I find some other books very annoying when they bring out these new classes and they are too overpowered compared to the other ones, but because they want people to purchase their books, like, oh, if you purchase this one, you're going to triumph in all of your dungeon quests. But yes, the weapon master doesn't make the other classes obsolete. And this also makes me think about your book that has no AI whatsoever, no AI generated text, no AI art. Was it a difficult choice to make? Because nowadays there are a lot of designers that support themselves or rely rather on using AI.
yeah, that was a tough call, largely because, I mean, and some of this just came out to, budgeting and making choices. But um, if you look at most, books out there, there's very few exceptions where, I like when I look at some of the older tabletop RPGs in my shelves versus the newer one, you'll notice kind of the ratio of text to art has gone more and more towards art, versus some of the older manuals. And I've always enjoyed, really cool art in tabletop RPGs. It can be very evocative and everything, um, but like if you look even at the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook versus the 2014 one, now it sort of feels like every other page, half of the page is like, it's beautiful, but it's full splash art, and there's less and less text. So I knew it would be probably a bad idea from a presentation angle to go with, I'm going to stick with my guns because I personally feel pretty strongly about, not having AI writing. We should pay writers. Not having AI art, we can pay artists. And, some people have to go a different direction, and no judgment on that. Just for me, it's not something I wanted to do. And I knew it would create kind of a more Spartan or textbook look almost of and I did pay for some professional layout, so at least the borders are nice. It's got a clean presentation, but yeah, there definitely is the option to fill in a lot of space with AI art, so you kind of have that eye pleasing ratio of text to art. It just, for me, again, we're always sort of writing for ourselves. Whenever I buy a tabletop RPG book and I end up getting a very cool art book with very minimal text, I'm like, well, that's a very cool art book, but I was here to buy a tabletop RPG book. So, again, thinking of what I would be looking for in a book, I'm like, what, I'll just pay, professional artists to license some cover art and that'll be it. So yeah, it was kind of a hard choice because, anyone looking at the Forgotten Fate preview, and I did decide to expand the preview to be pretty much half the book, the entire rules content, because in the same way other books release their SRD, if you want to look at all the rules for it and then pay me $5 for the setting, that's more than fine. But anyone previewing it will notice like it is just a lot of text, because I did have to make that call of, and I suppose there was the third option of like paying for like human made art that's licensed like in bulk, because they do have those as well, bulk galleries for licensing. But I was looking into that, but then I sort of ran into some kind of horror stories of people who licensed those under the impression that they were licensing human made art, and then found out after the fact, oh, this was sold to me as human made art, but a fourth of it was AI generated. So ultimately I said, I'm just going to go with the known thing. I'll pay a human being for, a piece of cover art that they drew, and the rest of it will be text, and see how it goes. So
I actually like AI art and also writing, but I prefer human-made art and writing, mostly because in the case of the art, it starts to look a lot of the same. So I really like the imperfections of the human-made art. Sometimes they have that errors, sometimes some minor errors of perspective or proportion, but it actually enhances the mood in some cases. And in the case of AI writing, sometimes there is a repetitiveness. The AI is far from perfect, and you see some repetitive texts and that do not clarify certain things that only a human eye could make sense of things by connecting this paragraph with this other paragraph few pages back. And I don't blame like people who use AI art. Sometimes you are limited in whatever time resources, but I definitely prefer when they use the human touch. In other words.
yeah, that's a decision every creator needs to make for themselves. Again, no judgment. Times are hard and you got to do what you got to do. But yeah, for me, it's something that you know I felt strongly about. And it's, aside from, you're absolutely right, a lot of AI art and text can become very kind of homogenized, where it just has kind of that AI look, or AI sound to it when it comes to writing. But also, and this is kind of getting into some more kind of out there territory, but I don't know, when you read anything written by a person, whether it's a book, or you're watching a TV show and you laugh at a joke in a show that was written by a person, or you see a piece of art that was drawn by a person, inked by a person, whatever. There's, again, this is a little bit out there, but it is a kind of communication. Like some human somewhere told you that joke, maybe not face to face, but they were thinking of something that made them laugh, and then some person they'll maybe never meet laugh. That's still kind of an act of communication and sharing, and you lose that with AI created products. And there's not that same level of whether it's human imperfection or just humanity, but this is some person out there communicating something to me, even if they're a stranger, even if I'll never meet them. This is still a way that people can communicate with people, even in 2025. So
And that's true because at least at the moment, the AI doesn't experience, it is incapable of feeling that emotion. So it's not, it's simply at the moment impossible for the machine to translate something that only living beings have.
yeah, so that was
Mhm.
that was mainly how I ended up arriving at the decision. So, but which is also part of why I did have to compare it against other even indie RPGs to realize, like, which is the big reason why, despite being close to $300, or excuse me, 300 pages, I decided to price it at $5, because I'm like, what, people are expecting, kind of lavish full color art, even from indie games, even from third party games, thanks to there's a lot of Kickstarter successes. There's a lot of there's just a certain look and ratio of art to text people expect. So it didn't seem inappropriate for me to offer a whole lot of content for a very small amount of money, because I know that it doesn't have the kind of the presentation that people are probably more and more accustomed to, as that ratio of art to text has gone heavier on the art in tabletop RPGs versus the ones I used to remember from the 90s or even the early 2000s, where you maybe get art once a chapter or periodically, not the expectation that every single page is broken up by some cool pull out art to kind of so you get it.
And are there any plans to expand upon Forgotten Fate?
Yeah, I mean, that one's a bit of a maybe. So I did have an initial plan, which was, I know you mentioned that it has addressed some of the ambiguities in the fifth edition system, kind of like how Pathfinder Unchained did. And, Pathfinder itself is kind of building on 3.5. That was a big goal of it. But I kind of wanted to see how well it did, how much feedback there was, and if, I'm even in its current state, since writing it and publishing it, I've gone back and found more. Oh, this is a thing that I didn't address in fifth edition that still reads ambiguous or doesn't really make sense to everybody who runs it or plays it, or we're not all on the same page on that. I should have addressed. So my, as far as the core book, my potential, vision for that was if it does well, gets enough response from players with feedback on here's something I've always found confusing in the 2014 fifth edition rules. I wish this had more clarity, to go back and do kind of a final revision that's just this, completely or as close as it can be, ambiguity free take on fifth edition that, addresses everything, feels like a truly full and complete system that doesn't have a whole lot of, ask your DM for a judgment call. And then at that point, maybe go back and, license more art to do kind of a more elaborate version of it that might see print or print on demand. That's a potential for the core book. As far as beyond that, I have thought about doing some supplements, maybe a starter adventure or a longer campaign, or maybe even some smaller supplements highlighting some of the areas that aren't focused on as much in the core book, which centers again mostly on this continent with 4 warring nations, but some of the others receive smaller write-ups like Algol or Chobal, or those places aren't fleshed out as much as Palemos. So thought about doing some kind of region-specific supplements to it, but again, that's kind of all based on to some degree how much interest there is in the community with the core book of Forgotten Fate, how much feedback I get on it, and then just also time, in addition to that. So I do have some plans for it, but right now I'm still just working, getting the word out about the core book, trying to get more eyes on it, and then go from there. So there's possibilities, but nothing set in stone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, do you have anything else that you want to share with us before we wrap up the interview?
No, just I really appreciate you taking the time, and for anybody who likes that combination of things, if you like any of the weird fantasy literature, China Mayville, weird sci-fi, Philip K. Dick, if you like kind of the stranger, darker JRPGs like Shin Megami Tensei, any of those, mixture of Lovecraftian stuff, and if you like Delta Green and tabletop RPGs like that, the setting in Forgotten Fate might be up your alley. And rules wise, if you're comparing, if you like the 2014 fifth edition rules, but maybe it's, there's just too many ambiguities, you're weighing against, various upgrade options. Like, well, do we want to upgrade to the official 2024 rules and drop $90 on that? Do we want to, go all in on Tales to Valiant or Level Up, or do we want to wait for Cubicle 7s? Forgotten Fate is definitely another, I'm proud of it. Another solid option for ways to, I would say, change and improve your fifth edition games without being kind of locked into it wholesale. And it's only $5. So what's the harm? But so either way, if somebody's looking to change up the mechanics of their fifth edition game, or just looking for a setting that I would say offers some things that are different from the others out there, check it out. It's very cheap.
I agree. There you have it, folks. Derek, author of Forgotten Fate, thank you for being here once again, Derek.
Thank you, Abraham. I really appreciate it.
And thank you to all for watching this live stream. If you have any comments or questions, please let us know in the comment section of this video. And thank you so much to those of you that are going the extra mile to support the channel. If anyone else wishes to further support the channel, consider joining as a member using the super thanks button. You can also check out the information in the description and in the pinned comment. This has been your host, Abraham L. Jaguar, a professional game master. And remember, master roleplay and you will master the game. Once again, thank you, and I am going to stop the live stream in 10 seconds. See you later.